Hope and humiliation, Eleanor Ashworth had learned, were two sides of the same treacherous coin, and she had long since stopped flipping it. The rain fell steadily against her bedchamber window, a relentless drumming that seemed to echo the dull ache she carried always in her chest. And somewhere in the distance thunder rolled low and ominous across the London sky, as if the heavens themselves remembered what she could never forget. 3 years had passed since that midsummer ball, 3 years since she had walked through Lady Montgomery's garden, with her heart so full of foolish expectation, so certain that Lord Clarence Pemberton would finally speak the words she had been waiting to hear, and yet the memory remained as fresh and raw as if it had happened only yesterday. She had worn her finest gown that night, a confection of pale pink silk that her mother had saved for months to afford, and she had felt beautiful, truly beautiful, as Clarence led her toward the rose arbour, with promises glittering in his pale blue eyes. But he had not led her to a proposal. He had led her to the hedge where his friends waited, and she had stood frozen in the shadows as his voice carried clearly through the evening air, each word a blade that carved away everything she had believed about love and her own worth. "Marry Eleanor Ashworth," he had laughed, and his companions had laughed with him, that cruel chorus she would hear in her nightmares for years to come. "She's pretty enough for a poor man's daughter, but hardly worth sacrificing fortune for. Her father's debts are legendary. I'd sooner marry a merchant's daughter. At least she'd come with capital. Eleanor is merely practice." Practice. She had been practice, a diversion to pass the time until a worthier prospect appeared, and she had been too naive, too desperately hopeful to see it. Now Eleanor stood before her small mirror in her modest bedchamber, the wallpaper faded and peeling at the corners, the furniture worn but meticulously clean, and she examined the face that looked back at her with the dispassionate assessment of a woman who had learned to expect nothing. She was still young at 23, her chestnut hair still fell in soft waves that escaped their pins to curl at her temples, and her grey-green eyes, storm-coloured, her mother had called them, still held a certain depth that some might call beauty. The small beauty mark above the left corner of her mouth still drew the eye when she spoke, and her carriage remained straight and dignified despite everything that had befallen her family. But the girl who had believed in love, who had dreamed of passion and poetry, and a man who would choose her above all others, that girl had died in Lady Montgomery's garden, and Eleanor did not mourn her. She reached up, her fingers finding the hollow of her throat, where her grandmother's locket had once rested, that precious gold oval containing a miniature of her mother that she had worn every day since she was 16, and she felt the familiar pang of its absence. Sold, like so much else, to pay her father's mounting debts. Through the thin walls she could hear him now, pacing in his study as he did every night, the shuffle of his slippers and the occasional clink of glass against decanter, marking his passage through another evening of regret. "I will not hope," she told herself, pressing her palm flat against her breastbone, as if she could physically hold the words inside her heart. "Hope is a luxury for women who have not learned what men truly think when they believe themselves unheard." The thunder rolled again, closer now, and Eleanor turned from the mirror to watch the rain streak down the glass, each droplet a small surrender to gravity, to inevitability, to the truth that some things simply fell and could not be caught. The morning brought no relief from the grey oppression of the previous night. Only a thin, watery light that filtered through the parlour windows and illuminated with merciless clarity the faded rectangles on the wallpaper where paintings had once hung, those landscapes and portraits that had been sold one by one over the past 2 years, until the walls themselves seemed to bear the scars of their diminishment. Eleanor sat across from her father at the small breakfast table, the china before them chipped at the edges, but polished to a desperate shine by their single remaining servant, and she watched as Samuel Ashworth stared into his tea with the hollow expression of a man who had finally reached the end of his capacity for self-deception. He had aged terribly in these past months, his once distinguished features now gaunt and shadowed, his scholar's hands trembling slightly as they rested on either side of his untouched plate, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute defeat. "The creditors have given us a month," he said, and the words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of cold dread through Eleanor's carefully maintained composure. "Perhaps less. I received word yesterday evening that Mr. Hawkins will wait no longer for the payment on the house, and the others—" He stopped, his throat working, and Eleanor saw with a twist of her heart that there were tears gathering in his faded blue eyes, tears he was too broken even to hide. "I have given you nothing but my name and my regrets. If there is any path to security, Eleanor, you must take it. I have no right to ask you to share my ruin." She wanted to reach across the table and take his hand, to offer some comfort, but what comfort could she give when everything he said was true? He had been a good father in his way, gentle and loving, full of grand ideas about investments and opportunities that had crumbled one after another into dust, and she could not hate him for his failures any more than she could hate the rain for falling. A soft knock interrupted them, and their elderly housemaid entered with a bowl, silver tray that had somehow escaped the creditors, bearing a single letter sealed with burgundy wax. Eleanor took it without expectation, assuming it to be another bill, another demand, another reminder of all they had lost. But the handwriting gave her pause, elegant, feminine, addressed in the flowing script of someone who had never known want. Lady Henrietta Wellington requested the pleasure of Miss Ashworth's company at an afternoon salon 3 days hence. Eleanor nearly set it aside, nearly consigned it to the pile of correspondence that no longer mattered, but her father glanced up with something flickering in his defeated eyes. "Lady Wellington," he murmured, a ghost of his old social awareness surfacing briefly. "I heard at the club, before they revoked my membership, that the Duke of Ashford has been attending her gatherings. They say he is the wealthiest man in England, that he could buy half of London if he wished." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she held the invitation, the cream paper catching the grey light, and she felt something stir in her chest that she refused to name as hope. It was merely practical consideration, she told herself firmly, merely the recognition that a woman in her position could not afford to ignore any opportunity, however remote. She steadied her fingers through pure force of will and met her father's eyes. "I shall attend," she said, and her voice did not waver. Lady Wellington's townhouse rose before Eleanor like a monument to everything she had lost, its gleaming windows and immaculate facade, a sharp rebuke to the shabby hired carriage from which she descended, and as she smoothed the skirts of her dove-grey dress, 3 seasons old now, carefully mended at the seams and pressed until the fabric threatened to give way entirely, she felt the familiar weight of inadequacy settle upon her shoulders like a cloak she could never quite remove. The salon was already crowded when she entered, a glittering assembly of silk and jewels and easy laughter that seemed to part around her like water around a stone, and she navigated the edges of the room with the careful precision of a woman who had learned that invisibility was its own form of armor. Lady Wellington herself was gracious, clasping Eleanor's hands with genuine warmth and murmuring something kind about her late mother, but even that small kindness felt like charity, and Eleanor extracted herself as quickly as politeness allowed to find a quiet corner near the tall windows where she might observe without being observed. It was there, half hidden by the heavy damask curtains, that she saw him, Clarence Pemberton, his golden hair still perfectly arranged, his pale blue eyes still sliding away from direct contact, and beside him a woman who must be his wife, Lady Sophia, whose cold beauty and colder expression suggested that the fortune he had married had come at a price he was still paying. Clarence's gaze found Eleanor across the room, and his Lips curved into that familiar smile, the one that had once made her heart race and now made her stomach turn with remembered shame, and she saw in his eyes the same pitying condescension he had shown that night in the garden, as if she were a curiosity, a cautionary tale, a reminder of his own narrow escape from poverty's grasp. She turned away, her hand rising unconsciously to the hollow of her throat, and found herself addressed by a pleasant-faced matron whose name she did not catch, a woman who seemed determined to discuss the marriage prospects of every eligible gentleman in attendance. "And what of the Duke of Ashford?" the woman asked, gesturing vaguely toward the far side of the room. "They say he must marry soon, that his aunt has quite insisted upon it. Surely any young lady would be fortunate to catch his eye." Eleanor laughed, and the sound was bitter even to her own ears, shaped by years of disappointment and the fresh sting of Clarence's mocking smile. "I would marry any man but him," she said clearly, her voice carrying further than she intended in a sudden lull in the surrounding conversation. "They say he's cold as a marble statue and twice as hard. I want security, not a lifetime of frost." The curtain beside her moved, and Eleanor's heart stopped as a figure stepped forward, impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes the color of winter seas that fixed upon her face with an intensity that stole her breath. The scent of sandalwood and cedar reached her, underlaid with leather, and she knew with horrible certainty that this was the Duke of Ashford, that he had heard every word, that she had just insulted the wealthiest man in England to his face. Her cheeks flamed with mortification, but something stubborn in her refused to cower, and she lifted her chin even as the heat spread down her neck, meeting his unreadable gaze with what remained of her dignity. He studied her for a long moment, his expression revealing nothing, and then he inclined his head in the barest acknowledgment and walked away without a single word, leaving Eleanor trembling in his wake, and wondering if she had just destroyed the last chance she would ever have. Eleanor made her way toward the entrance hall with what she hoped appeared to be dignified calm, rather than the desperate flight it truly was, her heart hammering against her ribs and her cheeks still burning with the memory of those winter sea eyes fixed upon her face. But she had not gone 10 steps before Lady Wellington materialized at her elbow with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent decades navigating the treacherous currents of society. "My dear Miss Ashworth," Lady Wellington said, her voice low and her expression carefully neutral, "I wonder if you might spare a moment before you depart. His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, has requested a private audience with you, and I have offered the use of my study for the purpose." The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow, and for one wild moment she considered refusing, considered fleeing into the grey afternoon and never looking back. But Lady Wellington's hand was already guiding her down a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and Eleanor found herself too stunned to resist, her mind racing through every possible reason a man she had just publicly insulted might wish to speak with her alone, and finding none that did not end in her complete social destruction. The study was small and richly appointed, heavy with the scent of leather and old books, but beneath those familiar smells Eleanor detected something else. Sandalwood and cedar, stronger now in the confined space. And she knew before she turned that he was already there, standing before the window where storm clouds gathered in ominous purple masses beyond the glass. Lady Wellington withdrew with a murmured pleasantry, and the soft click of the door closing behind her seemed to seal Eleanor's fate as surely as any prison cell. The Duke did not turn immediately, allowing her a moment to study the breadth of his shoulders, the rigid line of his spine, the way his hands, large, she noticed, with long fingers, were clasped behind his back, with a tension that belied his apparent calm. When he finally faced her, his expression was as unreadable as it had been in the salon, but there was something assessing in his gaze, something that made Eleanor feel as though he were cataloguing every frayed thread of her dress, every carefully concealed mend, every evidence of the poverty she had tried so desperately to hide. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was deep and clipped, wasting no words on pleasantries, I find myself in need of a wife, a circumstance I have avoided for a decade but can no longer escape. My aunt insists, my title demands an heir, and I have grown weary of being pursued by every fortune-hunting miss in England who sees only my wealth and imagines herself in love with my consequence." Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, though she had no idea what she might say, but he continued as if she had not moved. "I require a woman of good breeding, who will not expect romantic nonsense, who understands that marriage can be a practical arrangement of mutual benefit rather than a theatrical performance of sentiment I am ill-equipped to provide. And I heard your words quite clearly, Miss Ashworth. Your desire for security rather than love. Your conviction that I am cold and hard and unsuitable for tender feeling." His jaw tightened, a muscle flexing near his temple, and Eleanor saw something flicker in those dark eyes that she could not name. "You said you would marry any man but me. I am asking you to reconsider." The silence that followed was so complete that Eleanor could hear the first distant rumble of thunder, could hear her own breath catching in her throat, could hear the wild, impossible hope that she had sworn never to feel again rising up despite every effort to suppress it. "I offer you my name, my protection, and my word that you will never want for anything," he continued, his voice dropping lower, each word precise and deliberate. "I will not pretend to offer love. I do not know if I am capable of it. But I will never lie to you, never shame you, and never give you cause to regret this arrangement." Eleanor thought of her father's tears, of the creditors circling like wolves, of the month, perhaps less, before everything they had left was stripped away, and she pressed her hand flat against her skirt to hide its trembling as she met the Duke of Ashford's unwavering gaze. "Yes," she said, and the word had barely left her lips when thunder rolled across the sky, deep and resonant, as if the heavens themselves were witnessing the vow she had just made to a man who had promised her everything, except the one thing she had learned never to want. Ashford Hall rose from the gentle spring landscape, like something from a dream. Eleanor had not dared to dream. Its honey-coloured stone glowing warm in the afternoon sunshine, its countless windows glinting like watchful eyes as the carriage swept up the long curved drive, and she pressed her gloved hands together in her lap to stop their trembling as she contemplated the magnitude of what she had done. Married a stranger, bound herself forever to a man who had promised her everything except love, and now arrived at this magnificent estate as its mistress, a title that felt as ill-fitting as a borrowed gown. The wedding had been quiet, almost perfunctory, conducted in a small London chapel with only her father and Lady Wellington as witnesses, and the Duke, her husband, she must learn to think of him as her husband, had spoken his vows in that same clipped, precise manner he used for everything, betraying no emotion whatsoever as he slid a gold band onto her finger and sealed their arrangement with the briefest possible touch of his lips to hers. Now, as footmen in immaculate livery descended the wide stone steps to attend to the carriage, Eleanor drew a steadying breath and reminded herself of the bargain she had made: security in exchange for expectations, comfort in exchange for hope, and if her heart ached with a loneliness she refused to name, well, that was a small price to pay for saving her father from ruin. Lady Augusta Blackwell waited in the grand entrance hall, a tall woman of perhaps 60 years, with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes that missed nothing, and she surveyed Eleanor with the sharp assessment of someone cataloguing every detail for future reference. "So you are the girl who called my nephew cold as marble," Lady Augusta said, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. But before she could stammer an apology, the older woman's lips curved into something that might almost have been approval. "Good. He needs someone who will not simper and fawn, and I suspect you have rather more spine than your circumstances might suggest." Mrs. Harriet Fenton, Leavewood, housekeeper, was more reserved, her curtsy correct and her welcome courteous, but her eyes watchful in a way that told Eleanor she would need to earn this woman's trust rather than assume it, and she felt the weight of scrutiny from every servant they passed, as the Duke led her through corridors that seemed to stretch forever, past paintings and tapestries and furniture that cost more than her father's entire house. The library stopped her breath. 2 stories of books, rising toward a painted ceiling, leather and gilt, and the accumulated wisdom of centuries surrounding her like an embrace. And beneath the familiar scent of old paper and binding glue, she detected something else, something that made her pulse quicken despite herself. Sandalwood and cedar, his scent, marking this space as undeniably his. "You may use any room in the house as you wish," he said, his voice formal, distant, and she nodded her thanks while her eyes caught on a worn volume lying open on the massive desk. Shakespeare's sonnets, the pages soft with frequent handling, and something shifted in her understanding of this stern, remote man who read poetry in his private hours. She stepped forward to examine the book more closely, and did not see the carpet's edge, worn and slightly raised, until her foot caught and she stumbled, a small cry escaping her lips as she pitched forward. But his hand was there, warm even through her sleeve, his fingers closing around her elbow with a grip that was firm and impossibly gentle, and he held her steady while she found her footing, held her for one heartbeat and then another, his dark blue eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. Then his jaw tightened, that muscle flexing near his temple, and he released her so abruptly that she swayed. "You should rest after your journey," he said, and he was gone before she could respond, leaving her alone in his sanctuary, with the ghost of his touch burning through her sleeve, and a vow forming in her mind with desperate clarity. "I will not hope for more than he has offered. I will not be foolish enough to fall in love with a man who has told me plainly he cannot love me back. I will be content with safety. I must." The days that followed settled into a pattern Eleanor could not quite name, a rhythm of breakfasts taken in near silence across a table that could have seated 30, of afternoons spent wandering through rooms so exquisitely appointed that she feared to touch anything, lest she leave some mark of her unworthiness upon the silk and mahogany, and of evenings in which she retired early to her magnificent chambers, rather than sit alone in parlours designed for gatherings she would never host. For Ashford Hall, she discovered, ran with the precision of a fine timepiece, every servant knowing their place and their purpose, every meal appearing exactly when expected, every fire lit and every candle trimmed without any instruction from her whatsoever, leaving Eleanor to wonder what exactly a duchess was meant to do when the household had functioned perfectly well for decades without one. It was this restless uselessness that drove her into the gardens on a mild spring morning. The air soft with the promise of warmth and sweet, with the scent of hyacinths and early roses. And she walked the gravel paths with no destination in mind, simply grateful to be moving, to be doing something other than sitting in her beautiful prison and contemplating the strange half-life she had chosen. The gardens were magnificent, of course. Everything at Ashford Hall was magnificent. But as Eleanor passed bed after bed of carefully tended blooms, she found herself searching for something she could not find, some particular flower that would have made this foreign place feel like home. And when Lady Augusta appeared beside her with that uncanny ability the older woman possessed of materializing precisely when least expected, Eleanor heard herself saying, "My mother grew white camellias. She had an entire border of them beneath her sitting-room window, and I used to help her tend them when I was small. But I do not see any here." Lady Augusta's sharp eyes softened almost imperceptibly as she replied, "The late Duchess preferred roses, I'm afraid, and Henry has not thought to change the plantings. But then, Henry thinks of very little beyond his tenants and his books and the walls he has built so carefully around himself." There was something pointed in the observation, something that invited confidence, and Eleanor found herself walking beside the older woman as Lady Augusta spoke of her nephew in fragments and glimpses, how he had been a solemn child, watchful and too aware of the tensions between his parents, how he had grown into a man who showed his care through deeds rather than words, how the servants adored him despite his reserve, because he remembered every name, every family, every trouble that befell those under his protection. Eleanor listened, and wondered, and when their path brought them near the edge of the formal gardens, where the land sloped gently toward the tenant village, she saw a figure she recognized, tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakable, standing beside a weathered cottage, speaking with a man who clutched his cap in work-roughened hands. She stopped without meaning to, half hidden by a flowering hedge, and watched as her husband, this cold marble statue of a man, laid his hand upon Mr. Thomas Reed's shoulder with a gentleness that made her breath catch, his voice carrying faintly on the spring air as he promised to send the physician that very afternoon, asked after the children by name, young Samuel and little Nettie and the baby whose cough had worried them so, and arranged for food to be delivered from the hall's kitchens until Mrs. Reed was well enough to manage again. His voice was warm, concerned, utterly unlike the clipped formality he used with Eleanor, and she felt something shift in her chest, some wall of her own beginning to crack. "He watches you when you are not looking," Lady Augusta said quietly, appearing at Eleanor's elbow as if she had known exactly what Eleanor would witness. "My nephew has spent 10 years building walls around his heart. You, my dear, appear to have found a door. Whether you choose to open it is, of course, entirely your affair." The invitation to dine had arrived 3 days prior, carried by a liveried footman from the neighbouring estate, and Eleanor had watched her husband's jaw tighten in that now familiar way as he read Sir Oscar Ridley's florid script requesting the honour of paying his respects to the new Duchess of Ashford, a request that could not, Lady Augusta informed her with barely concealed distaste, be refused without giving offence, however much one might wish to do precisely that. Sir Oscar arrived precisely at the appointed hour, a portly gentleman of perhaps 50 years, with a florid complexion and pale eyes that swept over Eleanor with an assessment she found distinctly unpleasant, his bow correct, but his smile carrying that particular condescension she had learned to recognize during her years of reduced circumstances, the smile of a man who believed himself superior and saw no reason to hide it. "Your Grace," he said, lingering over the title as if testing whether it truly belonged to her. "What a delightful surprise that Ashford has finally taken a bride. We had quite given up hope, had we not, that our dear Duke would ever consent to share his magnificent solitude." And Eleanor felt Henry stiffen beside her, felt the temperature of the room drop several degrees as her husband offered the barest minimum of courtesy in return. Dinner was an exercise in endurance, course after interminable course, during which Sir Oscar held forth on the superiority of his estate, his horses, his hunting dogs, and most especially his roses, those legendary roses that had won prizes at 3 consecutive county fairs and attracted admirers from as far as London itself. And Eleanor maintained her composure with the skill born of years of navigating social situations where she was made to feel small, nodding at appropriate moments and offering the expected murmurs of admiration, while Lady Augusta caught her eye across the table with an expression of such eloquent suffering that Eleanor nearly choked on her wine. Henry spoke little, his responses clipped to the point of rudeness, and when Sir Oscar turned his attention to Eleanor with patronizing inquiries about whether she found country life terribly dull after the excitement of London, whether she had any little hobbies to occupy her time, whether she might benefit from his wife's guidance in learning to manage a proper household, she answered with perfect dignity, while something hot and sharp built behind her ribs. It was only later, in the drawing-room, after Sir Oscar had finally departed in a cloud of self-satisfaction and eau de cologne, that Eleanor allowed herself to speak, her voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the sudden blessed silence. "I confess I found Sir Oscar's discourse on roses most illuminating. I had not previously understood that a flower's worth, like a gentleman's, might be measured entirely by the attention it demands and the space it requires, while contributing nothing whatsoever of genuine beauty to the garden." The sound that escaped Henry was like nothing she had heard from him before, a laugh, deep and startled and utterly genuine, breaking from him before he could prevent it. And when she turned to stare at him, she found his face transformed, the stern lines softened by candlelight and mirth, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that made him look years younger and impossibly, devastatingly handsome. He caught himself almost immediately, the laughter fading to something quieter, but no less warm. And he regarded her with an expression she could not quite decipher as he said, "You are not what I expected, madam." Eleanor felt her lips curve despite herself, felt that familiar tilt of her head that betrayed genuine pleasure, and heard herself reply, "Nor you, your grace." He walked her to her chamber door, as had become their custom. But tonight he paused at the threshold, and she held her breath as something unspoken trembled in the air between them. But he only wished her good night, his voice lower than usual, rougher. And when she closed her door and leaned against it, she pressed her hand to her chest and felt her heart racing beneath her palm like a bird desperate for flight. The days following Sir Oscar's visit settled into something Eleanor had not dared to expect, a rhythm, a pattern, something almost resembling companionship. For Henry no longer vanished immediately after breakfast, but lingered over his coffee, asking her opinion on matters of the estate, listening with genuine attention when she ventured observations about the tenants she had met during her walks or the books she had discovered in the library, and she found herself looking forward to these quiet mornings with an anticipation that frightened her even as she cherished it. He remembered, she noticed with wonder, the smallest details of their conversations, that she preferred her tea with lemon rather than milk, that she found the morning room's eastern exposure more pleasant than the formal breakfast room's grandeur, that she had mentioned once in passing a fondness for the poetry of the Romantics, and each small proof of his attention landed upon her heart like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that she could not contain. It was on a clear spring morning, the sky washed clean and blue after a night of gentle rain, that he appeared in the doorway of the morning room, where she sat with her correspondence, and said, without preamble, "I am riding out to inspect the northern fields. Would you care to accompany me?" Eleanor felt her cheeks warm as she admitted, "I ride poorly, I am afraid. My father could never afford to keep horses, and my instruction was limited to a few lessons in my youth that I have largely forgotten." But instead of the dismissal she expected, instead of the polite withdrawal of the invitation, Henry simply nodded and said, "Then I shall teach you, if you are willing to learn." The stables smelled of hay and leather and horse, and Eleanor stood beside a gentle grey mare, while Henry dismissed the hovering grooms with a word, and turned to her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something patient and almost soft. And when he guided her foot into the stirrup and helped her mount, his hands at her waist were firm but careful, and she felt the warmth of them even through the layers of her riding habit. He adjusted her grip on the reins, his gloved fingers covering hers, and she noticed for the first time the small scars that marked his hands. Working hands, she realized. Hands that had done more than sign documents and hold teacups. And when she asked about them, he admitted he often labored alongside his tenants during harvest, that he could not bear to watch others work while he stood idle. They rode slowly through fields golden with spring sunshine, and he spoke more freely than she had ever heard him speak, of his love for this land that had been in his family for generations, of his hatred for London society with its empty rituals and vicious gossip, and when she asked, emboldened by the ease between them, "Why poetry? Why do you read it when you cannot sleep?" He was quiet for a long moment before answering, his voice low and rough. "Because poems tell the truth that polite conversation forbids." She told him then of her mother's stories of the Italian lakes, of the dreams she had nursed as a girl of travelling to see them herself, and he listened as if her dreams were precious things worth preserving, and Eleanor felt hope kindle in her chest like a flame she could not extinguish no matter how she tried. Sleep eluded her that night, chased away by thoughts she could not quiet, and feelings she dared not name, and so Eleanor found herself wandering the darkened corridors of Ashford Hall in her dressing gown, a single candle clutched in her hand, casting wavering shadows upon walls hung with portraits of Blackwell's long dead, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress through their ancestral home, as if judging whether she truly belonged among them. The rain had begun some time after midnight, a steady drumming against the windows that reminded her of that first night in her father's house, when she had vowed never to hope again, and she moved through the sleeping house like a ghost, her bare feet silent upon the thick carpets, until she turned a corner in the east wing and stopped. For there, beneath a door she had never entered, a sliver of golden light spilled into the darkness. She should return to her chamber. She knew should respect whatever privacy her husband sought in this hidden room at such an hour, but something drew her forward, some instinct she could not name, and before she could think better of it, her hand was upon the door handle, turning it slowly, pushing the door open just enough to see within. The room was small and feminine, decorated in shades of rose and cream that spoke of another era, another sensibility entirely unlike the masculine grandeur that characterized the rest of the house. And in a chair beside the rain-streaked window sat Henry, his broad shoulders curved inward in a posture of such profound grief that Eleanor's heart clenched painfully in her chest, and in his hands, held with a tenderness she had never witnessed from him, was a small portrait of a woman with dark hair and kind eyes, eyes that Eleanor recognized at once as the source of her husband's own winter sea gaze. He did not hear her enter, so lost was he in whatever memories the portrait conjured, and she watched as his thumb pressed against his signet ring in a gesture that seemed unconscious, habitual, the gesture of a boy seeking comfort he could no longer find. And when at last he sensed her presence and looked up, his face was unguarded in a way she had never seen it, raw with an old pain that time had not healed. She expected him to send her away, to rebuild those walls she had watched him construct so carefully around himself. But instead, he simply looked at her for a long moment while the rain wept against the windows, and then he said, his voice rough and low, "My mother. She was married for her fortune. Did you know that? My father never loved her, never pretended to love her. He treated her with contempt from the day they wed until the day she died, believing herself worthless, believing herself unworthy of the love she so desperately craved." And his voice broke on the final words, cracked like ice giving way beneath too great a weight, and he pressed his thumb harder against the ring, as if he could anchor himself to something solid. "I will not," he began, and stopped, his jaw working, that muscle near his temple flexing with the effort of containing emotions too vast for words. And when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "I will not be my father." Eleanor crossed the room to where he sat, and she did not touch him, did not presume upon grief so private and so profound, but she knelt beside his chair, so that her eyes were level with his, and she said with quiet certainty, "You are not him. I see that clearly. I have seen it in every kindness you have shown your tenants, in every gentle word you have spoken to your household, in every moment you have treated me with respect. I did not dare to expect." And something in his expression shifted, cracked open, and she understood at last that his coldness had never been cruelty but armor, protection forged in the fires of watching his mother's heart break day after day until there was nothing left of her to save. The morning after his confession dawned grey and uncertain, and Eleanor descended to breakfast with her heart full of words she did not know how to speak. But Henry was already there when she arrived, and one glance at his face told her that the walls had been rebuilt in the night, higher perhaps than before, as if he regretted the vulnerability he had shown her in that small rose-coloured room where his mother's memory still lingered like perfume. He rose when she entered, as he always did, but his greeting was clipped, formal, his winter-sea eyes guarded in a way they had not been for weeks, and Eleanor felt something sink in her chest, even as she took her seat across the vast expanse of polished mahogany, the spring flowers arranged in a crystal vase between them, suddenly seeming a poor bridge across the distance he had reconstructed. She was reaching for her teacup, preparing to fill the silence with some meaningless observation about the weather, when she noticed it, a book she had not seen before, bound in deep blue leather with gold lettering, placed beside her plate as if it had always been there, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She looked up at Henry, a question forming on her lips, but he was studying his newspaper with an intensity that seemed almost desperate, and so she lifted the book with trembling fingers and opened it to find page after page of exquisite engravings, the Italian lakes, rendered in such loving detail that she could almost feel the warm Mediterranean sun upon her face, could almost hear the lap of water against ancient stone, and her throat tightened with an emotion she could not name, for he had remembered, he had listened when she spoke of her mother's stories and her girlhood dreams, and he had acted upon that listening without announcement or expectation of thanks. She looked at him again, and this time he met her gaze for just a moment, before returning to his newspaper. And in that moment, his hand moved across the table to set down his coffee cup, and his fingers brushed against hers where they rested upon the book's cover. The touch so brief it might have been accidental, might have been nothing at all, except that she felt it like lightning through her entire body, and she saw his jaw tighten in that familiar way that meant he was feeling something he would not permit himself to express. The days that followed brought more such moments, small gifts appearing without explanation. A new shawl in the precise shade of green she had once admired in a shop window, a volume of Wordsworth's poetry with certain passages already marked. And Eleanor began to understand that this was how he spoke, not with flowery declarations, but with consistent, thoughtful action, with proof upon proof that he saw her, truly saw her, in ways no one ever had before. It was Mrs. Fenton who finally gave voice to what Eleanor was beginning to comprehend, finding her one afternoon in her private sitting room and settling into a chair with the comfortable familiarity of a woman who had earned her place in this household through decades of loyal service, and as she spoke of Henry as a boy, how he had once given his own coat to a shivering stable boy, how he had wept for a week when his mother died and then never wept again. Eleanor felt the last of her defences crumbling, and when the housekeeper said quietly, "He's not cold, Your Grace. He's careful. There's a difference," Eleanor understood at last that she had broken every promise she had made to herself, that she was falling in love with her husband with a depth and intensity that terrified her, for she had been hurt before, had learned the bitter lesson of hope betrayed. But this felt different, felt like something worth the risk of breaking, and she did not know whether to weep with joy or with fear at what she had allowed herself to become. The Montgomery ball blazed with 1,000 candles, their light cascading from crystal chandeliers to pool upon the polished floors, where the finest families of the county had gathered in silks and satins and jewels that winked like captured stars, and Eleanor stood at the threshold of the grand ballroom, with her heart beating so fiercely she was certain it must be visible through the sapphire silk of her gown, that gown which Henry had chosen himself, had presented to her that morning in a box lined with tissue paper, saying only that the colour reminded him of something precious. And she had not understood until she clasped his mother's pendant around her throat, and saw how perfectly the deep blue of the fabric matched the stones that lay against her skin. How he had planned this, had thought of her, had wanted her to carry a piece of his heart into this glittering arena where she would be judged and measured, and found either worthy or wanting. His hand settled against the small of her back as they entered, warm and steady through the layers of fabric, and she felt herself straighten beneath that touch, felt courage flow into her from the point of contact as if he were pouring his own certainty into her veins, and when the major domo announced them, His Grace the Duke of Ashford, and Her Grace the Duchess of Ashford. The sea of faces that turned toward them held curiosity and assessment, but also, she realized with dawning wonder, respect, for she was no longer Eleanor Ashworth of the faded gowns and the sold paintings. She was the Duchess of Ashford, and the man beside her had chosen her, had defended her, had filled a greenhouse with her mother's flowers because she had mentioned them once in passing. Lady Augusta appeared at her elbow within moments, resplendent in violet silk, her sharp eyes sweeping the room with the satisfaction of a general surveying a battlefield already half won, and she murmured, "You look magnificent, my dear. Now go and remind them why my nephew chose you." And Eleanor found that she could smile, could move through the crowd with her hand resting lightly upon Henry's arm, could exchange pleasantries with countesses and baronesses who looked at her with something approaching admiration rather than the pity she had once dreaded. She was witty without being cutting, gracious without being obsequious, and when she made Lady Henrietta Montgomery laugh with a clever observation about the challenges of managing country estates, she caught Henry watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Pride, yes, but something warmer beneath it. Something that looked almost like wonder, as if he too was surprised by what she was becoming in the shelter of his regard. She was beginning to believe she might truly belong here, might have found her place at last, when the crowd shifted and parted, and she saw them approaching through the glittering throng. Clarence Pemberton, with his golden hair perfectly arranged and his pale eyes sliding over her with that familiar condescension, and beside him his wife Sophia, beautiful and cold as a marble statue, and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as Clarence smiled that smile she remembered from the garden 3 years ago, and said, his voice carrying just far enough to reach nearby ears, "Why, if it isn't little Eleanor Ashworth, or should I say your Grace, how very unexpected indeed." The silence that followed Clarence's words spread through the ballroom like frost across a window-pane, and Eleanor felt herself frozen within it, her limbs turned to stone, her tongue to lead, as nearby guests paused in their conversations and turned with the predatory interest of those who scent scandal upon the air. And Clarence, emboldened by wine, and by the bitter jealousy that twisted his handsome features into something ugly beneath their polished surface, pressed his advantage with the cruelty she remembered all too well from that garden 3 years ago. "One does wonder," he continued, his voice pitched to carry just far enough, his pale eyes sliding away from direct confrontation, even as his words struck like blows. "What arts a penniless girl must employ to catch such a prize as the Duke of Ashford. Surely there must be some explanation for such an improbable match. Some desperate stratagem that persuaded a man of his standing to take on a bride with nothing to recommend her but a pretty face and a mountain of her father's debts." Eleanor's hand flew to her throat, where the sapphire pendant lay against her skin, that gesture of distress she could not suppress, and she opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but no words came. For she was once again that girl in the garden, hearing through the hedge the laughter of men who saw her as nothing more than practice, as a stepping stone, as something to be used and discarded, and the shame of it washed over her in a wave that threatened to pull her under entirely. But then Henry moved, a single step forward that somehow commanded the attention of every eye in that glittering room. And when he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, cold as winter seas and sharp as forged steel, and though he did not raise it above a conversational tone, every syllable carried through the sudden absolute silence with the weight of a death knell. "You speak of arts and traps, Lord Pemberton," he said, and the use of the formal title was itself an insult, a reminder of the vast gulf between a viscount and a duke. "You, who courted a woman you never intended to marry, who led her to believe in your regard, only to humiliate her publicly for sport, who stood in Lady Hartwell's garden and declared to your sniggering companions that she was merely practice, pretty enough for a poor man's daughter, but hardly worth sacrificing fortune for. You dare to stand in my presence and impugn the honor of my wife?" Clarence's face drained of color, and Eleanor heard a gasp from somewhere in the gathered crowd, heard the rustle of silk as ladies leaned closer to catch every word, and Henry continued, his winter-sea eyes never leaving Clarence's face. "You chose gold over worth, Lord Pemberton, and I see how well that choice has served you, trapped in a loveless marriage with a fortune you cannot touch, watching the woman you discarded rise to heights you can never reach. My wife has more dignity in her smallest gesture than you possess in your entire being." He turned then to address the assembled company, and his voice softened, not at all as he declared, "The Duchess of Ashford is the finest woman I have ever known, and anyone who suggests otherwise insults not only her, but me, and I do not forgive insults." In the ringing silence that followed, he reached for Eleanor's hand, raised it slowly to his lips, and pressed a kiss to her gloved fingers, while holding her gaze with an intensity that stopped her breath. And she saw in his dark blue eyes something that looked like devotion, like fury on her behalf, like love itself made manifest, and she understood that everything had changed. The carriage wheels rattled against the cobblestones as they pulled away from the blaze of the Montgomery ball, and Eleanor sat in the velvet darkness with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trembling still from what had transpired in that glittering room, from the words Henry had spoken before all of society, words that had shattered something within her and rebuilt it into a shape she did not yet recognize. And she opened her mouth to speak, to thank him, to find some way to express the enormity of what he had done for her. But her voice emerged broken and strange, catching on the tears she had not permitted herself to shed before the watching eyes of the Ton. "Your Grace, she began, but the words dissolved into something perilously close to a sob, and she pressed her gloved fingers to her lips as if to hold back the flood of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her entirely, for no one had ever defended her like that. No one had ever thought her worth defending, and certainly no one had ever stood before the cream of society and declared her the finest woman they had ever known, with such fierce and unwavering conviction. Moonlight streamed through the carriage window, silvering the planes of his face as he sat across from her in silence, his dark blue eyes fixed upon her with an expression she could not read. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, stripped of the cold formality he wore like armor. "I told you I would never give you cause for regret," he said, and she heard in his tone the echo of that vow he had made in Lady Wellington's study, that promise she had clung to through the uncertain early days of their marriage. "I meant it then, and I mean it now, but Eleanor—" and her breath caught at the sound of her Christian name upon his lips, the first time he had spoken it, intimate and tender and devastating in its simplicity. "What I said in that ballroom was not performance, not mere defense of my own honor or name. I meant every word, every syllable, and I would say them again before any audience in England if it would erase the pain that man once caused you." The carriage swayed as they turned onto the long drive toward Ashford Hall, and Eleanor found she could not speak, could only look at him through eyes blurred with tears she no longer tried to hide. And when they arrived, and he handed her down from the carriage, his fingers lingered upon hers for a moment longer than necessity demanded, warm even through their gloves, steady and sure. He walked her to her chamber door as he had done so many nights before, but tonight the air between them was charged with something electric and unnamed. And when they stopped before her door, he did not immediately bid her good night, but stood looking down at her with those winter-sea eyes that had warmed to sapphire in the candlelight of the hall. And then, slowly, deliberately, he drew off his glove and raised his bare hand to her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek with such infinite gentleness that she felt tears spill over onto his skin, and he brushed them away with his thumb, as if they were precious, as if she were precious, and said only, "Good night, Eleanor," before turning and walking away down the corridor, and she stood trembling in his wake, one hand pressed to the cheek he had touched, knowing with terrible and wonderful certainty that she loved him completely, desperately, irrevocably, and terrified beyond measure that he might never feel the same. The days that followed the Montgomery ball unfolded like the petals of summer roses opening to the sun, each one revealing some new facet of the man Eleanor had married, some fresh evidence that the cold and distant duke she had once believed him to be had never truly existed at all, but had been merely a mask worn by a man who had learned too young that vulnerability invited pain. And now that mask was slipping, falling away piece by piece to reveal the warmth beneath. And she found herself dizzy with the discovery of him, breathless with the growing certainty that something fundamental had shifted between them on that moonlit night when he had touched her cheek and spoken her name as if it were a prayer. He sought her company constantly now, appearing in the breakfast room before she had finished her first cup of chocolate, lingering over his coffee to ask her opinion on matters of the estate, the drainage of the lower fields, the repair of the tenant cottages, the selection of a new steward for the northern properties, and listening with genuine attention when she ventured observations, his dark blue eyes warming to sapphire as she spoke, that muscle in his jaw relaxing in a way she had come to recognize as pleasure. They rode together through the golden mornings, his patience infinite as he guided her improving horsemanship, and in the library during the long summer evenings they read side by side in companionable silence, or he read aloud to her from volumes of poetry while she worked at her embroidery, his deep voice wrapping around the verses like velvet around jewels, and sometimes she would look up to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart stutter against her ribs. Small gifts began to appear without announcement or explanation, a new riding habit in deep forest green, which he must have noticed was her favourite colour, though she could not recall ever mentioning it, draped across the chair in her sitting-room one morning. A first edition of Miss Austen's Persuasion, which she had admired in a bookseller's window during their brief visit to the village, resting upon her pillow one evening. Sheet music for the Scottish airs she loved to play, tucked between the pages of her correspondence, and he never spoke of them, never waited for thanks, never even acknowledged their existence when she tried to express her gratitude, merely changing the subject with that slight tightening of his jaw that she now understood meant he was moved but could not say so. The household noticed the change. She could see it in the knowing glances exchanged between footmen, in the softening of Mrs. Fenton's stern features, in the way the maids smiled when they saw the Duke and Duchess walking together in the garden, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing, and holding it as they strolled past the roses that bloomed in profusion along the gravel paths. Roses of every colour, crimson and gold and palest pink, their perfume heavy in the warm air, and yet Eleanor noticed with a small pang that there were still no white camellias among them, those flowers her mother had loved, though she had mentioned them only once. So long ago now. Lady Augusta found her there one afternoon, standing before a bed of yellow roses, with her face tilted toward the sun, and the older woman's sharp eyes missed nothing as she observed, "I have never seen him like this, my dear. In 30 years I have." "Never seen him like this? And I begin to believe I was right about that door." Eleanor's heart swelled with something perilously close to joy, with hope so fierce it frightened her, for she had hoped before and been destroyed by it, had stood in another garden believing herself loved, only to discover she was merely practice, merely a stepping stone, merely something to be discarded when a better prospect appeared. And yet when Henry appeared at the garden gate and his face transformed at the sight of her, when he crossed the lawn with that long stride and took her hand and raised it to his lips as if he could not help himself, she found that the old fear, though it whispered still in the darkest corners of her heart, could no longer drown out the growing chorus of possibility. The summer evening had settled into that particular golden stillness that precedes a storm, the air grown heavy and expectant, and Eleanor sat in her accustomed chair in the library, with her embroidery lying forgotten in her lap, watching Henry where he stood by the window with the worn volume of Shakespeare's sonnets in his hands, that same volume she had noticed on his desk the very first day she arrived at Ashford Hall, And she remembered thinking then how strange it was to find poetry in the possession of such a stern and forbidding man, not understanding yet that his sternness was armor and his silence was not emptiness, but rather a vessel filled to overflowing with feelings he had never learned to speak. He turned from the window as the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the parkland, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken, made her set aside her needlework with hands that trembled slightly, and when he crossed to the chair beside hers and opened the book, she saw that the pages fell naturally to a place well worn with reading. The spine cracked there as if these particular words had been returned to again and again across the lonely years. "Let me not, to the marriage of true minds, admit impediments," he began, his voice low and resonant in the quiet room, wrapping around the familiar verses with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken." And outside the storm drew closer, the wind rising to rattle the casements. But Eleanor could not look away from his face, from those winter sea eyes that had warmed to deepest sapphire as he read. "It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom." He closed the book slowly, deliberately, and in that moment lightning split the sky beyond the windows, flooding the library with brilliant white light that illuminated every plane and angle of his face, and she saw there something naked and unguarded, something that made her heart clench with desperate hope. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was raw, stripped of all pretense, "I need to show you something. Tomorrow, when the storm has passed, will you come with me?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words, and when he rose and offered her his hand to escort her to her chamber as he had done so many nights before, the simple touch sent fire racing through her veins, and at her door he did not reach for her cheek as he had done that moonlit night after the ball, but instead took her hand in both of his, turned it over with infinite gentleness, and pressed his lips to the center of her palm in a kiss so tender it shattered something within her, and then he folded her fingers over the place where his mouth had been, as if giving her something precious to keep, something she might hold close through the long hours until morning. And when he released her and walked away without another word, she stood trembling in the doorway, her closed fist pressed against her heart, and she did not sleep that night, could not sleep, for every time she closed her eyes, she felt the ghost of his kiss burning against her palm like a promise, like a prayer, like the first bright spark of a flame that would consume them both. The morning after the storm dawned, washed clean and brilliant, the sky a tender blue scattered with clouds like wisps of cotton, and Eleanor descended the stairs with her heart beating so fiercely she could feel it in her throat, in her fingertips, in the palm of her hand, where the ghost of his kiss still lingered like a brand, and she found Henry waiting for her in the entrance hall with an expression she had never seen before, something almost nervous flickering beneath his usual composure, a vulnerability that made her want to reach for him and smooth the tension from his jaw. He offered her his arm without speaking, and she took it, and together they walked out into the morning where the world sparkled with the aftermath of rain, every leaf and blade of grass adorned with diamonds of moisture that caught the sunlight and scattered it into tiny rainbows, and he led her away from the formal gardens she knew, past the rose walks and the ornamental lake, toward a corner of the grounds she had never explored, where a stand of ancient oaks gave way to a clearing she did not remember, and there stood a structure of iron and glass that seemed to have sprung from the earth like something from a dream, its panes catching the morning light and transforming it into liquid gold. "I wanted to wait until it was finished," he said quietly, and his voice was rough with something she dared not name. "Until everything was perfect." And he opened the door and drew her inside, and Eleanor stopped breathing, stopped thinking, stopped being anything but pure, overwhelmed sensation for the greenhouse, was filled with white camellias, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, their waxy petals gleaming like pearls in the diffused sunlight, their delicate fragrance rising around her in waves that carried her back to childhood, to her mother's garden, to everything she had lost and mourned and never thought to find again. "You remembered," she whispered, and her voice broke on the words, and the tears came before she could stop them, spilling down her cheeks as she turned to look at him. This man who had listened to a single passing comment months ago and built her a cathedral of flowers in response, who showed his heart not through pretty speeches, but through actions so profound they left her shattered and remade. He stepped closer, and she could smell him beneath the sweetness of the camellias. Sandalwood and cedar and leather. That scent she had come to associate with safety, with home, with everything she wanted. And when he spoke, his voice was halting, each word seeming to cost him something precious. "I told you once that I did not know if I was capable of love," he said, and his winter sea eyes had warmed to the deepest sapphire as they held hers. "I was wrong. I was merely waiting to meet you. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom." She reached for him then, her fingers closing on the lapels of his coat, and the words poured from her like water breaking through a dam. "I broke my promise to myself the moment you caught me in the library," she confessed. "I have loved you, I think, almost from the beginning. I was only too afraid to believe it could be returned." His hands came up to cradle her face with infinite tenderness, his thumbs brushing away her tears, and when he kissed her at last, it was gentle and fierce all at once, and she kissed him back with everything she had, surrounded by her mother's flowers, in the house he had built for her, and she knew with perfect certainty that she had finally come home. The hours between the greenhouse and nightfall passed in a haze of stolen glances and touches that lingered a heartbeat too long, of dinner where neither of them tasted a single bite, and conversation that faltered into charged silences filled with everything they had not yet said with their bodies. And when at last the household settled into sleep and the summer darkness wrapped Ashford Hall in velvet quiet, Eleanor stood before the mirror in her chamber and watched her maid unfasten the sapphire pendant from her throat, that pendant the colour of his eyes when he looked at her kindly, his mother's pendant, given to her the morning after their wedding, with words so spare and yet so heavy with meaning. But tonight she stopped the girl's hands and said she would wear it still, and when she was alone in her nightgown, with her chestnut hair unbound and falling in soft waves about her shoulders, she heard the door open behind her and did not turn, because she knew, with every fibre of her being, that it was him. His reflection appeared in the mirror beside hers, tall and broad and still dressed, though his cravat was loosened and his dark hair disordered, as if he had run his hands through it 100 times while waiting, and their eyes met in the glass with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. And then he was crossing to her, his hands settling on her shoulders with a gentleness that made her tremble, and he pressed his lips to the curve of her neck, just above where the sapphire rested against her pulse. "Eleanor," he breathed against her skin, and she turned in his arms and reached for him, pulling him down to her, and when their mouths met, it was nothing like the tender kiss in the greenhouse, but something deeper and more desperate, months of longing finally given permission to burn. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, and carried her to the bed where moonlight spilled across the linens like liquid silver, and every touch was a question answered with trust, every whispered word a vow more sacred than any spoken in a church. And when he paused to search her face with those winter sea eyes gone dark with wanting, she pulled him closer and said yes. Yes. Yes, with her hands and her lips and the arch of her body against his. The sapphire pendant lay cool against her heated skin as he mapped her with reverent fingers, as gentle with her as she had seen him be with no one else. And she understood at last that this tenderness was not weakness, but the greatest strength he possessed, The choice to be everything his father had not been, to cherish rather than consume, to give rather than take. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the moonlit darkness, her head upon his chest where she could hear the steady thunder of his heart, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder, and she said softly, "I did not know it was possible to feel this way." And he pressed his forehead to hers so that they breathed the same air and answered, "Nor I, we learned together." And there was nothing more to say, no promises left to make, for they had already given each other everything, and so they simply were together, complete, while the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the night held them safe in its embrace. The grand ballroom of Lord and Lady Montgomery's London townhouse blazed with the light of 10,000 candles, their flames reflected and multiplied in crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls from the gilded ceiling. And Eleanor moved through this glittering world with the quiet confidence of a woman who had learned that true worth had nothing to do with the whispers of society, and everything to do with the steady presence of the man whose hand rested at the small of her back, warm and possessive and utterly unwavering, as it had been all evening, all season, all the months since that morning in the greenhouse when their lives had truly begun. Her gown was white silk, overlaid with silver lace that caught the candlelight and transformed her into something luminous, and tucked into the elaborate arrangement of her chestnut hair were 3 perfect white camellias from the greenhouse he had built her, their waxy petals gleaming like pearls against the rich brown waves, and at her throat the sapphire pendant rested as it always did now, the colour of his eyes when he looked at her kindly, which was always, always, for he looked at her no other way. The season had declared them its greatest triumph, this duke who had avoided matrimony for a decade, and the quietly dignified woman who had somehow thawed his legendary reserve, and Eleanor could feel the weight of admiring gazes following them as they moved through the crowd, could hear the murmured compliments that replaced the whispers of a year ago, but none of it touched her as deeply as the simple pressure of Henry's fingers against her spine, the way he inclined his head to catch her softest words, the manner in which his winter sea eyes, warm now, so warm sapphire rather than ice, returned to her face again and again as if she were the only fixed point in a spinning world. Lady Augusta intercepted them near the refreshment table, resplendent in purple silk and the family amethysts, her sharp old eyes bright with satisfaction as she surveyed her nephew and his bride, and she leaned close to Eleanor with a smile that held decades of wisdom and a single year of vindication. "I told you there was a door," she said, her voice low enough for only Eleanor to hear. "I did not tell you that you would become his entire world." And Eleanor felt her eyes sting with grateful tears, even as she smiled, for it was true, impossibly and wonderfully true, and she had done nothing to deserve such fortune except to hope when hope seemed foolish, and to trust when trust seemed dangerous. Across the ballroom, half hidden by a marble column, she caught a glimpse of golden hair and pale eyes that slid away from contact. Clarence Pemberton, haggard now, his beauty faded into something pinched and petulant, and beside him Sophia, with her bitter mouth and her disappointed eyes, 2 people trapped in the gilded cage of their own shallow choices. And Eleanor felt no triumph, no satisfaction in their misery, only a profound and quiet gratitude that she had escaped that fate, that the cruelest moment of her life had ultimately led her here, to this man, to this love, to this happiness she had never dared to imagine. Henry's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her own, and when she turned to look at him, he was already watching her with that soft expression that still made her breath catch even after all these months, and he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles before the entire assembled company. "Dance with me," he said, and his voice was low and tender and meant only for her despite the hundreds of witnesses, and she let him lead her onto the floor where the orchestra struck up a waltz, and as they moved together in perfect harmony, she knew that every moment of pain and humiliation had been worth it, every tear and every fear, because they had brought her here, to his arms, to his heart, to a love that would bear it out, even to the edge of doom. 5 years had passed since that morning in the greenhouse, when Henry had given her white camellias and words she had never dared to dream of hearing. 5 years of happiness, so complete that Eleanor sometimes paused in the midst of ordinary moments, pouring tea, walking the grounds, watching her husband read by firelight, simply to marvel that this life was truly hers. And on this golden autumn afternoon, she made her way along the gravel path toward the greenhouse, with the slanting October light warming her shoulders, and the russet leaves of the great oaks drifting down around her like nature's own confetti, her heart already lifting at the sound that reached her ears before she even opened the glass door. Her daughter's laughter, bright and bubbling and utterly irresistible, the most beautiful music Eleanor had ever known. Camilla Rose Blackwell was 3 years old, named for the white camellias that had become the symbol of her parents' love. And she had her father's dark hair falling in unruly curls around a face that held her mother's grey-green eyes, those storm-colored eyes that lightened with joy as they did now while she stood on tiptoe beside a potted camellia, her small fingers reaching toward the waxy white petals with the reverent curiosity of a child who had been taught that flowers were precious things deserving of gentleness. Henry knelt beside her, this man who had once been called cold as marble and twice as hard, and his large scarred hands that had caught Eleanor in a library so long ago, hands that had built this very greenhouse, hands that had cradled their daughter from the moment of her birth, guided Camilla's touch with infinite patience, his deep voice soft as he named each bloom for her. And when he looked up and saw Eleanor standing in the doorway with autumn light gilding her chestnut hair, his winter sea eyes warmed to that sapphire shade she knew so well, the shade that meant love, that meant home, that meant everything they had built together from the ruins of her broken hopes and his carefully constructed walls. "Mamma!" Camilla cried, abandoning the flowers to run toward Eleanor on sturdy little legs, and Eleanor swept her up and breathed in the sweet scent of her hair, feeling Henry rise and cross to them, feeling his arm come around her waist as it always did, as natural as breathing, as essential as her heartbeat. "Papa says the white flowers are yours," Camilla announced with the grave importance of a child sharing a tremendous secret, "but I think they should be mine because they are the prettiest." And Henry laughed that deep, surprised laugh that Eleanor had first heard over Sir Oscar Ridley's roses so many years ago, the laugh that still made her chest ache with love. "Papa, Mamma's flower is the prettiest," Camilla amended, looking to her father for confirmation with those grey-green eyes. And Henry's gaze lifted to Eleanor's face, held it with 5 years of devotion and a lifetime's promise shining in those depths, and he said simply, "Yes, she is," and pressed his lips to Eleanor's temple, while Lady Augusta watched from the greenhouse doorway, with a smile that spoke of prophecies fulfilled, and doors that had opened onto worlds more beautiful than anyone had dared to imagine. The twilight settled over Ashford Hall like a benediction, soft purple shadows gathering in the corners of Eleanor's private sitting room, while the last golden light of the October sun painted long rectangles across the worn carpet where she had paced so many times in those early uncertain days. And she sat now in her favourite chair by the window, with her hands folded in her lap, and her grey-green eyes, storm-coloured eyes that had learned to lighten with joy, gazing out at the grounds where her daughter had played that afternoon, where her husband had knelt among the white camellias and taught their child the names of flowers. And she found herself thinking of the woman she had been 8 years ago, that wounded creature who had stood before a rain-streaked window and vowed never to hope again, because hope was a luxury for women who had not learned what men truly thought when they believed themselves unheard. How wrong she had been! That frightened girl with her grandmother's locket sold and her heart carefully locked away. How terribly and wonderfully wrong, for she had learned in the years since that the right love was not a trap, but a liberation, not a cage, but a door thrown wide onto gardens she had never dared to imagine. And the man who had opened that door had done so, not with grand declarations or flowery promises, but with 1,000 small consistencies, 1,000 quiet proofs that his word was his bond, and his heart, once given, was given absolutely. She thought of his vow in Lady Wellington's study, spoken in that clipped formal voice while thunder gathered outside. "I will never lie to you, never shame you, and never give you cause to regret this arrangement," and she marvelled at how completely he had kept it, how every day of their marriage had been another stone laid in the foundation of a love built not on passion's lightning strike, but on trust's steady flame. The kind of love that warmed ordinary mornings and transformed mundane moments into treasures beyond price. The door opened behind her, and she did not need to turn to know it was Henry, for she knew his footsteps as she knew her own heartbeat. And when he crossed to her chair and looked down at her with those winter-sea eyes that had long since thawed to perpetual summer, she smiled up at him with all the gratitude of a woman who had been given everything she never dared to want. "What are you thinking of?" he asked, his voice that low rumble she loved, and she reached for his hand and felt his fingers close around hers, warm and strong and permanent, and she said simply, "Of how wrong I was, and how grateful I am to have been wrong." And he raised her hand to his lips as he had done 1,000 times before, and would do 1,000 times again, and in that gesture was everything, every promise kept and every fear conquered, and every ordinary, extraordinary day of the life they had built together. And so, dear listener, we leave them there in the gathering twilight, their hands intertwined and their hearts whole, proof that hope is never foolish when placed in worthy hands, that walls built from old wounds can become doors when the right person finds them, and that love, true love, bears it out even to the edge of doom and beyond, into the quiet, golden forever of two people who chose each other and keep choosing every single day.